Wel, croeso cynnes I chi i'r bedwaredd o'n sesiynau ar Raymond Williams. Yn oes globaleiddio wedi galw'r gyfres, ni wedi bod yn Ewrop a Brazil a Japan, ac heddi ni'n cyrraedd China yn yr cyfarfod ola yma. A very warm welcome to you all. I can see many attendees are already arriving to my right. It's a delight to host this event at Swansea University, a series of symposia arranged by the Centre for Research into the English Literature and Language of Wales. I've had the help of Merryn and Jiao in arranging this. Merryn came to Swansea some years ago to work at the archives while she was a PhD student, and working with Merryn and Shenzhen University on this event has been a pleasure. This is the last of our sort of global symposia. I call them Raymond Williams in the Age of Globalization. And we have taken advantage of the opportunities of Zoom to meet like this. And I'm hoping that the events will appear on our website in due course. I'm Daniel Williams, and I'm a professor of English at Swansea University, editor of Who Speaks for Wales, a collection of Raymond Williams's writings on Wales that has been re-released in a new edition for this centenary year. So I'm very honored to have the company of Professor Zhang Xiaohong this morning, who will just say a few words from China. Professor Zhang.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. Dear Professor Daniel Williams, dear Merryn Williams, prestigious Chinese professors and scholars, on behalf of Shenzhen University, co-organizer of this centenary Williams Symposium, I hereby express my heartfelt greetings to you all. As one of the most important British Marxists and pioneers of culture studies, Raymond Williams influenced many fields. Moreover, this influence has long extended to China, where his literary and culture theories, as well as his literary productions, have been objects of academic research since the 1980s. Hence, it is our honor to co-host this centenary Williams Symposium with Swansea University. Giving Shenzhen's status as China's first special economic zone and the city's integral role in linking Guangdong to the Hong Kong-Macau Greater Bay Area, Shenzhen University is well known for its equally experimental and reformatory role in China mainland's higher education sector. Shenzhen University is committed to excellence in teaching, research, and social service. Adhering to its model of self-reliance, self-discipline, and self-improvement, the university is dedicated to serving the Shenzhen Special Economic Zone, facilitating the implementation of China's reforms, and continuing to pioneer change in higher education. The School of Foreign Languages of Shenzhen University offers 5 BA programs: English, Japanese, French, German, and Spanish. Moreover, it has high-quality faculty with a broad vision, enduring strength, and an international perspective. Over the past 5 years, the school is carrying out research projects at the national, provincial, and municipal levels, with a total funding of RMB 5 million. During the said period, the school's research team has published about 80 monographs edited volumes and book translations, and nearly 500 research papers. Furthermore, the school is highly committed to cultivating a diverse student body to enrich the educational experience provided by its well-established programs and disciplines. The school has built a comprehensive talent training system characterized by first-class teaching and research facilities, a high-quality learning environment, and internationalization. Upholding its model of fluent in Chinese and foreign languages and learning from the East and the West, the School of Foreign Languages does more than teach languages, as it is also an important interface between China and the rest of the world. I'm extremely grateful to Swansea University for initiating this important symposium, Remote Williams in China. I also cordially welcome the Chinese professors and scholars who have accepted our invitation to share their knowledge and expertise on Raymond Williams. I'm sure this symposium will provide a great platform for the two countries to engage in scholarly exchange and in particular to have fruitful and rewarding discussions this afternoon and your morning, right? I wish you every success with this important symposium, and I look forward to learning of the outcome. Thank you all very much for coming and joining us, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for those words of welcome, Professor Zhang, Xiaohong. As you say, I hope this is the beginning of future dialogues and collaborations as well. The major role of Swansea University in relation to Raymond Williams' studies is the fact that we hold the Raymond Williams papers that were deposited to Swansea University by the family more than 10 years ago now. And of course, they've been the center for international scholars to come to Swansea over the years. That's been the basis for arranging these events. As this is the final symposia, I should like to thank Eve Johnson, a PhD student in English at Swansea, who's helped me to arrange these events and designed and has maintained the website that we have, which is where these events will eventually go up. And I'm delighted this morning that we have the company of Merryn Williams. Merryn is a poet, a critic. She's written on figures such as Catherine Mansfield and Thomas Hardy and Wilfred Owen and others. But of particular significance today, of course, Merryn is also Raymond Williams's daughter, and was kind enough to join us today just to say a few words of welcome. Merryn, over to you for a few minutes. Croeso cynnes, a warm welcome.
Well, thank you, Daniel. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Am I muted? Well, hello, and greetings to you all from Oxford, England, where we're still struggling with COVID. I gather that you're doing a whole lot better in China, and I hope it won't be long before some of us can meet in person in England or in Wales. It's now 100 years since my father was born, which seems incredible to me, of course. But I still get letters about him from all over the world. He's still being translated into many different languages. And there are still conferences like this one, which attract people from all over the world. I'm so glad about that. I'm really delighted that he's being discussed in China. And I'm very happy to see so many distinguished scholars from China here today. And I hope, I hope perhaps to meet you in person one day, and that today you have a very successful conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Merryn. And thank you also for your support over the years to Swansea University and our various Raymond Williams initiatives. It's always greatly appreciated. As Merryn mentioned, I mean, hopefully in the future we will be able to meet face to face, although the opportunities opened up by the virtual reality that we inhabit has also been also something we might develop over the years. But in relation to actually coming to Swansea, you're very welcome to come and to work at the archives, where Dr. Katrina Legg is the main archivist. Katrina knows all the files and dark corners of the Raymond Williams archives and has helped tens of people over the years to locate materials. So Katrina, if you'd like to just say a few words from the archives and maybe welcome people in the future to come to Swansea.
It's lovely to be here this morning and to see so many participants who I hope at some point will be able to come to Swansea and take advantage of the archive. We've recently reopened for 2 days a week, which is a major step forwards after having been closed since last spring. We have already had some Raymond Williams researchers in, which is encouraging. So hopefully you'll be able to follow those in due course. I was slightly amazed to see the description of me as being not only the cataloguer, but a dedicated tracker of stray references. And as Daniel said, I'm very much here in the role of an archivist to help you as researchers access material that will be beneficial to your studies. There is an online catalogue, and I will just pop the reference into the chat now. So that link will get you through to the Raymond Williams online catalogue. It's also on the Symposia website, so you can find it there too. The collection is extensive. It's over 60 boxes of material, and the majority of that relates directly to Raymond Williams and covers the 1940s to the 1980s. It covers his entire life. It's wonderful. It's everything from juvenilia right the way through to his academic publications, his work with the Workers' Educational Association, so that's adult education, his teaching, his plays, his short stories, novels, exploration of film, poetry. Then we have, well, just countless newspaper reviews that he did. I have to say, Merryn, I don't know how your father created so much, well, not only thinking, but actually being able to share that thinking with the rest of the world. It's a phenomenal output. There are talks, lectures, radio, TV work. There are his notebooks, which I will try and impress on you as scholars, are just a wonderful source where you see his ideas coming through. His handwriting can be a little tricky to read in places, but usually as the researchers know the topics, as an archivist, I can help to some degree with the handwriting, and working in collaboration, we can get you to the information that you're seeking. There's a lot of correspondence as well, so it's lovely to hear that Merryn is still receiving letters about her father, because within the collection there are over 400 individuals writing to Raymond Williams, which just shows what an impact he was having and how his ideas were being received and developed with his interactions with others. It's just great to read, you know, this breadth and depth is fantastic. As I said, we are limited in our opening now, but we are there. So we would really encourage you to email us. So it's see if I can pop that in the chat and get it to the right people this time. So it'll be going to archives@swansea.ac.uk. and that's our general email account, and someone in the office will pick it up. So I know that I can see one face that has visited before, and would love to welcome you back again, Merryn. We are here to help. The collection is there to be used. It was wonderful when we had the chance to receive the collection and to catalogue it, to get that catalogue online and to start welcoming people in. Even if you can't visit at the moment, that shouldn't stop you contacting us, because we may be able to find other ways of providing a degree of access. However, we would love to see you all in the future. And I know that Daniel is a very welcoming academic face, and we do the archival bit to the best of our ability. I hope you have a wonderful symposia today. It's just lovely that there's been this sort of build up throughout, and I hope that I can join you a little bit later in the day.
Lovely,
Thanks,
thank you, Katrina. So yeah, let me just reiterate all that Katrina has said. So in terms of just the way the symposium works, as you see, we're set up as a webinar. So there's a group of us in the screen, so to speak, with attendees appearing in the list of participants or attendees on the side. The chat and the Q&A are open. So if people have comments they want to make who are not panelists, then you're welcome to use either of those. And even myself will keep an eye at that during the day. We'll listen to all three papers for each of the sessions first, and then have a question and answer afterwards, depending on the time that we have. I appreciate it will be getting later in China as we come to an end, but not too late, I hope. Okay, so without further ado, let us begin then. We are slightly early, but there are advantages to that. I'm aware that Zoom fatigue can set in, so I've arranged a break after the first panel. Yeah, I'm very much looking forward. So we begin, as both Merryn and Katrina has said, we have a group of very distinguished academics with us, and it's a privilege and a pleasure both to meet you all and to have the opportunity to introduce you. So first is Professor Wang Ning, one of China's leading scholars who's taught at many universities. I should say that on the website we have both a program and speaker biographies and paper abstracts. I won't read the full biography that's online, but Professor Ning has taught at many universities in China, has been a Ford Distinguished Visiting Professor at Yale, Northrop Frye Fellow at Toronto, and has been a fellow, well, across the world in various periods of his career, very widely published, also a transnational series of publications. As one of the most productive scholars and literary cultural critics, Professor Wang Ning has published extensively both at home and abroad, author of 3 books in English and 21 in Chinese, over 500 articles, of which over 130 are in English. So it's a very, very great pleasure to welcome you to open today's papers. Professor Wang Ning, over to you.
Well, thank you very much for your kind invitation and introduction. I should first of all, yes, to say a few words about my interest in Raymond Williams. As one of the earliest Chinese scholars to introduce Raymond Williams to the Chinese audience, as early as in the late 1980s, published a book review. To introduce to the Chinese audience his monumental book, Marxism and Literature. in which I was, inspired so much so that I spent, much time supervising in the past 20 years two doctoral students to devote their dissertations on Raymond Williams. So today I would like to address the topic, Raymond Williams' Marxist theory and its inspiration to China's literary and cultural studies, as I have just completed a key national social sciences fund project, Marxism and World Literature Studies, in which there is one chapter devoting to Raymond Williams, written by my student. So in the current international circles of comparative literature and literary theory, the issue of world literature has become a heatedly discussed topic. This is certainly related to the huge influence of globalization on culture and literature. Contemporary Western scholars are usually inspired by Goethe's conjecture on world literature, viewing it as a process of literary production, circulation, and translation, according to David Demrush. Although they recognize the contributions made by Marx and Engels to the formation of world literature as a theoretic concept in their co-authored book, Communist Manifesto, they seldom, following this line, explore the irreplaceable contribution of Marxism to the study of world literature and world culture. As a matter of fact, Marx and Engels have made many insightful comments and descriptions on such classical writers in the history of world literature, like Dante, Shakespeare, Goethe, Schiller, Balzac, Dickens, Ibsen, etc., and their literary achievements, all of whom have long been canonical authors in world literature. Their insightful ideas are certainly of foundational significance in Marxist thought on world literature studies, especially when literary studies are confronted with challenges raised by cultural studies in the contemporary era. It is true that the random thoughts by Marx and Engels on literature have been interpreted and developed by the later Eastern and Western Marxist theorists, of whom British Marxist literary theorists like Raymond Williams and Terry Eagleton, one of my good friends, have contributed a bit to the development of Marxist literary theory and criticism. Although they were not involved in a debate on the issue of world literature, their theoretical contributions have frequently been quoted and dealt with in current world literature studies, especially from a Marxist point of view. Frankly speaking, their insightful ideas and critical works on Marxist literary critical principle have also inspired us Chinese scholars in our literary and cultural studies. Today, in commemorating the centenary of William's birth, we cherish him all the more as a pioneering figure of Marxist literary theory and attach particular importance to his literary and culture as well as theoretical heritage. To discuss the issue of Marxism and world literature, we should start from reading the works of the founders of Marxism. Although Marx and Engels paid great attention to world literary phenomena, they were also greatly inspired by the conception of world literature constructed by German writer and thinker Goethe. According to existing research, the term Weltliteratur is generally regarded as a utopian concept, coined and elaborated by Goethe in conversation with young scholar Eckermann in 1827. Goethe, then in his 70s, concluded after reading some non-Western literary works, including Chinese and Indian literary works, I quote, "I'm more and more convinced that poetry is the universal possession of mankind, revealing itself everywhere and at all times in hundreds and hundreds of men. I therefore like to look about me in foreign nations and advise everyone to do the same. National literature is now a rather unmeaning term. The epoch of world literature is at hand, and everyone must strive to hasten its approach. Here, Goethe uses poetry to refer to literature in general, pointing out the common aesthetic features of the literature of all countries and nations, especially the Oriental literature, which has been unknown but attractive in the world for a long time, thus constructing his view of world literature. It should be admitted that on the whole, Goethe's view of world literature still has a tinge of Eurocentrism, or more specifically, of German centrism. It is ironic, however, that Goethe's conception of world literature was largely inspired by his reading of non-Western literary works, including some Chinese literary works of minor importance. Today's Chinese readers may have forgotten such minor works as Hao Qiu Zhuan or The Pleasing History and others, but it was just these works that inspired Goethe to come up with the concept of world literature. This is something that comparatists should pay particular attention to. Later, in their co-authored book, Communist Manifesto, published in 1848, Marx and Engels borrowed the term to describe the cosmopolitan character of bourgeois literary and cultural production as a direct consequence of global capitalism. After examining all the expansion and growth of capitalism around the world, they concluded, I quote, all old established national industries have been destroyed or are daily being destroyed. In place of the old local and national seclusion and self-sufficiency, we have intercourse in every direction, universal interdependence of nations, and as in material, so also in intellectual production. National one-sidedness and narrow-mindedness become more and more impossible. And from the numerous national and local literatures, there arises a world literature, and I quote. Here, Marx and Engels, obviously inspired by Goethe's earlier conjecture, want to point out that the formation of world literature has its own law. As a result of the production and circulation of spiritual culture, world literature and world culture is closely related to the transnational material production and circulation, and that is a natural consequence of it. No doubt, the Marxist way of observing literary and cultural phenomena has certainly influenced and inspired Williams in his study of literature and culture. Although Marxism has been a guiding principle in China's socialist revolution and construction, there is not much domestic introduction to the study of world literature by the Western Marxists. Williams in China seem to be attached more importance to inner circles of cultural studies than in literary critical field. And indeed, there is not much written on the subject of Marxist world literature studies in Western academic circles either. The only academic monograph available today in the Chinese context that deals with Marxism and the world literature as an important topic is a book, Marx and the World Literature, by S.S. Brawell, professor of the University of Oxford. The book was published in Britain in 1976, and its Chinese version became available in 1981. This book mainly reviews Marx's critical comments on some outstanding writers and works in the history of world literature, which has been highly praised by scholars at home and abroad since its publication. However, the author does not study world literature as a theoretical concept, so the book has little influence on current world literature studies and discussions in the current international academic circles. What is even worse is that today's scholars of world literature studies rarely cite this work or deliberately overlook it. But admittedly, the book still reveals the fact that Marxist interest in literary creation and criticism is not isolated, but is linked to his reflections on the great social and political problems in which he finds himself. Although Marx was primarily a great thinker and philosopher, he did not write a book-length literary critical work. From time to time, his economic, philosophical, and political writings reveal his insights into literary creation and theoretical discussion. If in commenting on Marx's own reading and criticism of world literature, Brouwer had a wealth of primary source, then discussing the social and the cultural realities of the second half of the 20th century is certainly a reality that Marx himself cannot experience. So the value of his book lies in its creative use of Marxist fundamentals to explain today's social cultural realities. What the author tries to emphasize in this book is that although Marx himself did not foresee the rapid development of modern society, and therefore did not foresee the literary situation in today's post-industrial and postmodern society, but Marx accurately predicted some of the symptoms of the present age in accordance with the inexorable laws of history. Indeed, as a result of the development and renewal of the means of production and circulation, the production and circulation of literature have been greatly facilitated, which has led to the expansion of the dissemination of literature into a universal sphere, rather than being limited to specific ethnic groups and countries, as was the case in the past. Therefore, contemporary Marxist theorists and scholars on the interpretation of Marxism has a lot of space. In this respect, Raymond Williams has published quite a lot of both literary works and critical and theoretical works from the Marxist point of view, enabling British Marxist literary theory to be unique among various Western Marxist theories. The fact that Williams rose in Britain as a Marxist theorist is by no means surprising. Born into a working class family, Williams knew clearly how hard the working class people's life. It was thus easier for him to accept Marxist theory and involve himself in British Marxist movement. Also, as we know, Britain has had a long tradition of Marxism among European countries, and Marx in his lifetime wrote many of his books and articles at the British Library. There are still quite a few scholars in British universities who call themselves Marxists. As leading Marxist theorists in Britain, Raymond Williams and Terry Eagleton were really outstanding and the most influential, not only in Britain, but also elsewhere, including in China. They are both literary scholars and critics, with many of their works translated into Chinese and discussed in the Chinese context. I myself got acquainted with Terry Eagleton in the 1990s and even invited him to attend the international conference I organized in the 1990s. But I did not have the chance to meet Williams because of his early death. Although they have not made a comprehensive and in-depth study of world literature, however, their thoughts and discussions on some theoretical issues have provided important theoretical basis for today's literary and cultural studies. Unlike Marx and Engels, Williams pays particular attention to the aspect of language and culture in his literary theory, which has been largely neglected even by Marx himself. In the first chapter, Basic Concepts of Marxism and Literature, Williams begins with a careful examination of his own nation's literature, the history of English literature, although his focus is mainly on the excellent works of English literature. However, these works are also classics of world literature. Their significance and influence have already transcended the boundaries of the English-speaking world and entered the cultural context of the whole world. Therefore, these theoretical problems of universal significance that he raised are also applicable to the study of other national literatures, especially towards Chinese scholars of literary and cultural studies today. In addition, Williams visited Western Europe, North America, and a number of Asian countries to study the Marxist movement and the state of research there, while writing his almost pure theoretical academic monograph, Marxism and Literature, in order to highlight a relatively universal significance of literary thought. On the basis of his extensive reading of Marx's original work, he found that Marxism, by contrast, had contributed little to the theory of language itself. So he set out from there with the important idea of cultural materialism throughout the book. If we look at the reception of his book in countries and regions outside the Western world, including in China, we can say that this goal of his has basically been achieved. I first read this book in the late 1980s, when Williams was not even known in China, and was immediately impressed by his unique ideas and dynamic understanding and creative development of Marxist literary theory. I then wrote a book review and had it published in the leading Chinese journal of literary and art study, as I recognized that it is Williams' original contribution to world Marxist literary studies. Later, when elite literature was on the decline due to his great works and a significant influence in the field of culture studies, Williams still remains very central in China's literary critical circles. Thus, in today's commemoration of Williams' centennial birthday, we will certainly cherish all the more his tremendous contribution to Western Marxist literary theory and try to inherit his Marxist literary and critical heritage. But what is the significance of Williams' heritage towards Chinese scholars of literary and cultural studies? This is what I want to sum up before ending this short speech. As I have already briefly discussed Williams' contribution to the study of world literature, I here just want to mention another important aspect of his significance and influence. As we all know, Williams has made great achievements in the following three fields: literary creation, for which he has published quite a few novels, short stories, and plays; literary theory, especially for his monumental book, Marxism and Literature; and last but not least, culture studies, for which he has been recognized as one of the leading figures in British culture studies. Different from those dogmatic Marxist theorists, Williams applies Marx's fundamental principle to contemporary social and cultural realities in a creative way and offers his insightful analysis, thus developing Marxism in the new era. He believed that there were three cultures in Britain at that time: the dominant, the residual, and the emergent, which could also find embodiment in current China. Namely, Williams stresses that culture is a dynamic process of formation rather than something stagnant, nor is it a simple reflection of a foundation as it is productive. This has certainly given us insightful illuminations. I'm particularly indebted to Williams for his above achievements in these three fields and try to follow his example. Although I do not write literary works, except for occasionally writing some prose, I did culture studies and even introduced this research approach to the Chinese scholarship as early as in the 1990s, while I have been chiefly engaged in comparative literature studies. Inspired by Williams' practice to the above three fields, I also try to combine cultural studies with literary studies by putting the analysis of literary phenomena in a broad culture context. What has inspired me most is that in Williams, literary studies are not necessarily opposed to culture studies, but rather in a dialogic state coexisting with literary studies. In this way, following Williams' example, I, as a comparatist, always try to expand the narrow domain of literary study, trying to put literary phenomena in a broader cross-cultural context. And when I'm doing culture studies, I do not go too far away from literature and literary studies. The same is true of many of my Western precursors, like Northrop Frye, F.R. Leavis, and Raymond Williams. This is also a characteristic of China's culture studies, which are somewhat combined with literary studies, with so many eminent literary scholars involved in it. It is indeed that due to the joint efforts made by these literary scholars, current Chinese culture studies have taken on a new look, different from its counterpart in the West. Or we should say that we are now moving toward the construction of a sort of culture studies of Chinese characteristics. This sort of culture studies will not only incorporate many of the issues discussed and being discussed in current culture studies in the West, but also combine studies of cultural issues and phenomena in the Chinese context, such as traditional Chinese culture and its products, local operas and folk literature, and contemporary Chinese culture and its products, film and TV, consumer culture and community culture, and even internet writing, since culture in general is wide in scope and inclusive in connotation. Only by maintaining such an open and pluralistic attitude toward different cultures can we push China's culture studies forward and make it able to exchange and carry on equal dialogue with literary studies as well as international cultural studies scholarship. Judging by the above practice, I should say that many of us Chinese scholars of literary and cultural studies are more or less indebted to Williams for his theoretical doctrine and critical principle he has left us 33 years ago. But his theory and works are still discussed in today's literary and cultural studies circles, which will continue to guide us in China's literary and cultural studies in the future. Perhaps that is the best way for us to commemorate Williams and his great contributions to developing Marxist literary and cultural theory in the contemporary era. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Wang Ning, for a terrific opening to today's session, not least as it addresses so specifically some of the intentions of these symposia. Really, you know, the idea of Raymond Williams in the age of globalization, as you were suggesting, the age of world literature in some ways, which has its own history going back to Goethe and Marx, as you were elucidating. But then the dangers of that kind of world literature, I suppose, is that it loses sight of the particular. Well, towards the latter stages of your paper, then, you know, the particularity of China is, of course, of interest to us in the West, and the reception of Raymond Williams in China. Your description of Marxism and literature as a monumental text, for instance, is not an adjective used so much in Britain about that book. I don't think it's not given that kind of stature by many, but you know, it's interesting that you would describe it in precisely those terms. And of course, Raymond Williams was also aware of a culture in his native Wales that he wasn't completely a part of, but in his latter years did develop a reading knowledge of Welsh, a literature spoken by, or a language spoken by about 500,000 people, but with its own literary history going back to the 6th century. And where does a minor literature of that kind fit in the model of world literature is a question that we might ponder. So thank you very much for that paper. I will move on now to Professor Xu Delin, and it's again a great privilege to welcome you to us this morning, Professor Delin, or this afternoon in China. Professor Delin is director of CAS, the Center for Research of Literary and Cultural Theory, and the author of an award-winning book on a genealogical study of the Birmingham School, that will of course be familiar to many Williams scholars, founded by Richard Hoggett and developed by Stuart Hall, figures who have appeared in our previous symposia. So a very warm welcome to Professor Xu Delin, and we're looking forward to hearing your words.
Okay, thank you very much, Daniel, Professor Daniel Williams. Yes, last month, I organized a symposium to commemorate Raymond Williams in Xi'an, China, and about 50 Chinese scholars attended it. We had a very hot debate. And so it's a great honor for me to communicate with you all here. Yes, as I said, first of all, I would like to say many thanks to Professor Daniel Williams for your kind invitation. And thank you all very much to all the experts and friends interested in Raymond Williams in China. Yes, I agree with Professor Wang said just now. Yes, to commemorate Raymond Williams, we Chinese scholars should note or pay attention to the Chinese characteristics or the locality. Okay, and yeah, so my presentation is completely based on my personal observation of the Chinese facts, and so it will be open to any comment and criticism. Yeah, first of all, I would like to see the reasons for my talking about translation and reception of Raymond Williams in China. As you all know that, yes, in fact, just now Professor Wang also mentioned that British Marxist literary theories in the broadest sense have been increasingly well known and traveled to many parts of the world since the 1960s. And one of the most important reasons for this is just as Raymond Williams has demonstrated, the British Marxist literary theories are always and constantly making connections between the continental Marxism and British reality or Britishness. Or if we borrow an idea from Stuart Hall, yeah, they are articulating the continental Marxism and the British reality. As such, it is not only interesting, but also essential for us to explore and examine how the British Marxist literary theories interpret the new realities and the challenges brought up by Brexit. We all know, in my mind, Brexit is a historical event matching Margaret Thatcher elected Britain's prime minister in 1979. The other reason for my having this topic is that, yeah, I have been conducting a project concerning the Chinese appropriation of British Marxist literary theories in the so-called New Times, and Raymond Williams is my first concern. Okay, and as far as translation and reception is concerned, I think first I should talk about how Raymond Williams was found and accepted as an institution in China in the 1980s. As you all might have known, with China entering its historical new times in the year of 1978, China adopted the reform and opening up national policy and reorientated its way to modernization. As such, the Chinese intellectuals once strictly depressed during the Chinese Cultural Revolution began their reflection of the relationship between literature or culture and politics, which soon fueled an upsurge in aesthetics or aesthetics popularity or aesthetics favor. And such, as a result, on the one hand, the Soviet Union or Stalinist Marxism gradually gave way to various so-called Western Marxism represented by George Lukács, Antonio Gramsci, Frankfurt School. On the other hand, many European and American philosophical, literary, and political thoughts were introduced into China in the name of aesthetics, which in the end spawned another cultural enlightenment. Maybe here, a typical even ideal example is Frederick Jamerson's coming to China in 1985. You know, in 1985, Jamerson was invited to give lectures in PKU, Peking University, and he gave his lectures at Peking lasted about a whole term. Because of his lectures, many theories such as structuralism, post-colonialism, etc., and even especially post-modernism became known to Chinese scholars. But here, maybe it's worth to point out that because the Chinese prefer the abstraction to the imperialism obvious in British Marxism, British Marxist ideas, including British Marxist literary theories, failed at first to draw attention from the Chinese intellectuals, although formalist literary theories were warmly welcomed and accepted. For example, Foundations of Aesthetics, Principles of Literary Criticism by I.A. Richards, 7 Steps of Ambiguity by William Emerson. These books were translated into Chinese and widely read and heavily debated. And then, as far as the translation of Marxist ideas were concerned, yes, as Professor Wang Ning just mentioned, yeah, in 1980, or Chinese, a book entitled Karl Marx and World Literature was translated into Chinese. Okay, its author is S.S. Brower, an Oxford professor. And before that, and Ralph Fox's book, The Novel and the People, was translated into Chinese in 1975. But okay, in 1980, an important book was translated into Chinese, a book by Terry Eagleton, Marxism and Literary Criticism. Although this book, the Chinese version of Marxism and Literary Criticism, was not publicly issued, it was the first translated book of Western Marxism literary theory in the Chinese New Times. So, although it was not publicly issued, it still enjoyed a large and wide circulation in China. And because of this book, and many British Marxist literary ideas began to be known by the Chinese scholars. And then, as far as Raymond Williams' ideas were concerned, in the 1980s, some book chapters, some chapters of Raymond Williams' books were translated into Chinese. To be exact, in 1988, the realism and the contemporary novel from the non-revolution was translated into Chinese. And Marxism and culture was from culture and society was translated into Chinese. How and in fact, there in Marx realism and the contemporary novel got two Chinese versions in 1988. Yeah. And the two Chinese versions I mentioned just now, yeah, were found in continental China or the mainland China. What is okay? But I should point out that in 1985, Williams' Culture and Society was translated into Chinese and published in Taiwan, but not introduced to mainland China. Yeah, and then okay, so in the 1980s, Raymond Williams was introduced to China mainly as an aesthetician, because in because of the aesthetician popularity in mainland China in the 1980s. Okay, many Western ideas, including Western Marxist ideas, came to travel to China in the name of aesthetics. Okay. Then, just because of the cultural enlightenment or culture fever in the 1980s, culture as a concept became more and more popular in China. And one of the Chinese scholars foresee in the 1990s. Let's ignore what view the Chinese scholars concerned hold. For example, lots of them mainly talked about the disadvantages of the Chinese culture and the advantages of the Western cultures. However, they successfully drew the people's attention to culture and made culture a key word in the whole society of China, which implicitly contributed to the development and establishment of cultural studies in China. In the early 1990s, to be exact, in 1992, China sped up its cultivation and construction of market economy. As such, the Chinese cultural production became a new field of capital investment, which resulted in the appearance of popular culture as the ideology status. Faced with such a new reality and situation, many Chinese scholars realized their theories they learned before or their traditional weapons couldn't function any longer. Then they turned to the West again and found the newly established discipline, cultural studies. And here, maybe two professors of Chinese scholars could be studied as our example. One is Professor Dai Jinghua at PKU, and the other is Professor Wang Xiaoming at Shanghai University. Yeah, Professor Dai went to America and gave lectures and held seminars in quite a few universities about Chinese films and popular culture. When I came back in 1995, she set up PKU Center for Film and Cultural Studies. And Professor Wang Xiaoming, quite aware of the deficiency of the appropriate theories for the new realities, and so he warmly embraced cultural studies. He gave courses aimed at the analysis of culture, and later in the 1990s, he just gave have focused on the analysis of Chinese culture, contemporary culture, and then in 2001, he set up Shanghai Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies. Then, from the two examples, I cited the two examples to see that, yes, the coming into being of cultural studies as a kind of institutional existence in China. And in fact, many more books, more writings by Williams were translated into Chinese. First, I want to say is in 1991, Culture and Society was translated and published by PKU Press in 1991, and then in 1994, here's another book, Television, Technology and Cultural Form, was translated into Chinese and published in Taiwan. And then in 1999, his Williams' base and superstructure from Marxist literature was translated into Chinese. It got two. There appear two versions. One is published by one was published by a research in Marxist aesthetics. The other is another journal, foreign literature. And in 1999, another paper, another chapter from maybe here I should mention that, yes, Terry Eagleton, one review by Terry Eagleton was also about Raymond Williams, was translated and published in China. Resources for Journey of Hope. The significance of Raymond Williams. Yeah, this paper. Terry Eagleton's paper was very played a very important role in introducing Raymond Williams to the common Chinese scholars. Yeah. Then, so in the 1990s, just the book chapters were translated into Chinese and published in China, in mainland China and Taiwan. Then, so in the 1990s, Raymond Williams was mainly accepted as a cultural leftist nihilist or cultural theorist. Yeah. Then here, paradoxically, when cultural studies was just brought into the Chinese academia in the 1990s, it was on the one hand warmly welcomed and cherished by some organic intellectuals such as Professor Dai and Professor Wang Xiaoming, but on the other hand, rejected by some traditional intellectuals, so that there appeared a hot debate about cultural studies. Because cultural studies turn out to be rather fruitful as a method in various disciplines such as literature, sociology, history. The Chinese scholars expanded their understanding of cultural studies and cultural theorists such as Raymond Williams. Gradually, the debate about cultural studies came to a halt, and cultural studies found a range of applications. So there appeared a rapid institutional development of cultural studies in China in the new century. For instance, now dozens of Chinese universities are offering cultural study courses, and more than 10 universities can award a cultural studies degree. So because of this, Raymond Williams has been better recognized in the new century. And this happened because okay, maybe another two figures I should be cited here. One is not nearly 20 PhD theses, around 150 MA dissertations have been published, are available now about this we nearly 20 PhD theses, around 150 MA dissertations about Raymond Williams are available now in China. This happened. There are, of course, quite a few reasons, and an important reason is, more writings by Raymond Williams were translated and introduced to the Chinese students. For example, in 2002, Raymond Williams, The Politics of Modernism Against the New Conformists was translated and published in 2002. And then in 2003, Keywords of Vocabulary of Culture and Society was published in China, both in Taiwan and in mainland China. Okay, in Taiwan, to be exact, 2003 in Taiwan, 2005 in mainland China. And then in 2007, Modern Tragedy was, yes, by Professor Ning Ersu. Yeah, later he will give us a lecture. Yeah. In 2007, the Chinese version of Modern Tragedy was published. And in fact, in 2017, this book was reprinted. Yeah. Then in 2008, Marxism and Literature was translated and published in Central China. Yeah. And 2010, Politics and Letters was translated and published by in China. And then in 2013, The Non-Revolution was finally translated and published in China. And in 2019, The Non-Revolution got another version, another Chinese version, yeah, in China. And in 2013, The Country and the City was published. And in 2014, Resources of Hope, Culture, Democracy, Socialism was translated and published in China. So what I want to say here is that considering its history of over 20 years, the Chinese translation and reception of Raymond Williams is, on the one hand, obviously faster and faster, but on the other hand, remains to be characteristic of segmentation. That is, Raymond Williams remains to be mainly, the translation and reception remains to be mainly concentrated on Raymond Williams' cultural theories, so that we the Chinese scholars have failed to have a comprehensive understanding of Raymond Williams. And it's very difficult, it's very difficult for us to have efficient dialogues with the foreign experts or the foreign peers. Yeah, yes, we should say Raymond Williams is a theorist, but we should know, first of all, he is a critic, especially he is a literary critic. Without the understanding of this, without translating Raymond Williams' literary criticism, then we cannot understand Raymond Williams quite well. So considering the Chinese research of Raymond Williams is to a large degree guided and led by translation. I do hope that first in the future some more professionals and public houses will participate in the Chinese translation issue, including both translation and the copyright. Second, then more of Williams' books, for example, his novels, his books concerned with literary criticism, especially his ideas about film studies could be translated into Chinese in the near future. Okay, that's all I want to say first. So thank you very much, and any comment and criticism is welcome. Thank you. Back to you, Daniel Williams.
Thank you,
okay.
Ersu, Delin. That's a fascinating overview of the translation of Williams and the reception in China. It's striking, that it's in a way in the decades since his death that much of that work has been done. Well, the dialogue that you were evoking towards the end, well, may it continue and flourish from this point as well. But I'm sure there are questions that we can people will want to ask in relation to your fascinating paper. But we'll listen first to the final paper in this panel and then discuss the papers together. But thank you very much. So next is Professor Ersu, who we have met virtually in the past, but never face to face. I hope that happens in the future. Professor Ersu Ding has a PhD in English from the University of Minnesota and lectures at the Department of English at the Lingnan University. As we heard from Delin, Ersu translated modern tragedy. So perhaps Raymond Williams' most revolutionary text in some ways. He's also the author of Parallels, Interactions and Illuminations, Traversing Chinese and Western Theories of the Sign and of Signs and Meanings. So a warm welcome to you. The title of today's paper, I've been forgetting to give the titles prior to the papers, but it's Raymond Williams' Theory of Tragedy and Chinese Drama of Woe. Welcome, Professor Ersu.
Thank you very much, Professor Williams. Can you hear me?
Yes, no problem.
Okay. It's indeed good to see you again for the second time. It's in the virtual world. Hope to see you in person later on. It's now 11:15 a.m. London time, and it's 6:15 Beijing time, with a time difference of 7 hours. So I should send a very good morning to those who joined the event in Europe. And to those who are in the same time zone as mine, I say good evening. And I would also like to express my appreciation to the conference organizers especially Professor Zhang Xiaohong and Dr. Zhou Mingying of Shenzhen University for inviting me to participate in this very meaningful symposium. As we all know, Raymond Williams is a polymath of culture whose intellectual interests range from aesthetics, anthropology, history, and literature and cultural studies, to name just a few. And I'm glad that the two previous speakers, Professor Wang and Professor Ning, have touched upon many important areas where Williams made huge contributions, thus providing a fitting framework against which I can just focus on his theory of tragedy and its implications for the study of Chinese tragedy. The title of my presentation today, let me, can I share the screen with you? Let me show you here it is, okay. There it goes. The title of my presentation today is Raymond Williams's Theory of Tragedy and Chinese Drama of Wu. It should be noted here that before the 20th century, drama of Wu or Ku Xi was the main Chinese genre designator for the type of drama that stages human suffering. And since then, since the turn of the 20th century, the phrase has been gradually replaced by tragedy, 悲剧, which was imported from the West, alongside many other literary critical terms. Now, as an individual scholar, I have been working on a research project on tragedy. And here is an English, the project is in Chinese. Here is an English outline of what I plan to complete and publish in the near future. This is an English outline. As you can see from this PPT slide, my research project consists of two distinct parts. One on various traditions of tragic drama, and the other on theories of tragedy or theoretical discourse on tragedy. Quite a few sections of my book, highlighted here in red font, are on Chinese tragedy, as well as on modern Chinese discourse on tragedy. I must confess that my source of inspiration comes mostly from Williams's theory of tragedy, which I find to be very, very illuminating. Speaking of Williams's theory of tragedy, his insights on tragedy can be found in his, I quote, often neglected gem, Modern Tragedy, which was first published by Stanford University Press in 1966. What you see here is the cover page of that particular book. I first came into contact with this piece of treasure when I was a doctoral student at the University of Minnesota in the late 1980s. And I found the book to be a sharp contrast to those dizzying tomes on postmodern theories that I was required or advised to read as a graduate student at the time. Indeed, I liked the book so much that I decided to render it into Chinese, which was later published, which first published in 2007 and saw its second print in 2017. mentioned by Professor Xu. More recently, chapter 3 and 4 of the book, Tragedy and Contemporary Ideas, Tragedy and Revolution, were anthologized. This is the Chinese translation of the book, and the two sections of the book were recently anthologized in this book, Handbook of Modern Tragic Theories, edited by Professor Wang of Zhejiang University, who will also speak on the forum later in the evening. As a response to that, I myself wrote an article titled Raymond Williams on Tragedy and Revolution, which was carried on the website associated with the distinguished academic journal, Research on Marxist Aesthetics. This is the book, also edited by Professor Wang. Now, there is another book that I wish to mention here, The Death of Tragedy by Jiao. In the early 1960s, Williams was actually responding to the prevalent intellectual sentiment of the time that tragedy is dead, a view that is best formulated in Steiner's 1961 monograph, The Death of Tragedy, which you see here. Now, according to Steiner, tragedy as a form of literature had experienced two major periods of prosperity. One in the 5th century BCE of ancient Greece, and the other in the 16th and 17th century, particularly in England and France. And the occurrence or the prosperity of tragedy was made possible by the accompanying pervasive cultural assumptions about the injustice of man's fate or some immutable flaw in human nature. Now, with the advent and continuation of Enlightenment movement, which believes that human suffering is not located in blind fate or inhuman or innate human flaws, but caused by natural calamities and social injustices that can be overcome by the unlimited power of reason, then the literary form of tragedy has lost its vitality in the modern period, hence the death of tragedy or the theory of the death of tragedy. Raymond Williams, of course, held a totally different view. For him, tragedy is not a single and permanent kind of fact. This is a quote from his own book, but a series of experiences and conventions and institutions. Now, what this means is that for Williams, there's no single definition of tragedy that can fit all historical periods. Take Greek tragedy, for example. The chorus was an essential element to the Greek artist, but it was discarded by most traditions of later periods. And likewise, although there was still emphasis on rank and nobility of the tragic hero during Renaissance and neoclassical age, the moving force of tragedy became a matter of moral choice rather than a predestined situation as in previous historical periods. Specifically, Williams argues that it is still possible to write tragedy in the modern era, be it in a different form from its Greek and Renaissance predecessors. For him, tragedy does not have to be about the suffering and death of a prince or princess as in the past, but also about war, revolution, poverty, hunger, men reduced to objects and killed from lists, persecution and torture. It is the sad and private life of the latter that gives rise to what Raymond Williams calls modern tragedy. Now, as a fellow scholar of tragic theater, I totally agree with Raymond Williams that because our ideas and concepts change over time, we should avoid the tendency in us to seek permanent meanings and the critical concepts of tragedy. But I also wish to push Williams's historical approach one step further so that it includes a cross-cultural dimension or perspective. The reason for this is very simple, okay? Or the reason for my proposed expansion is very simple. Similar to Steiner's denial of the existence of tragedy after the 17th century, most tragic theorists in the West are of the opinion that tragedy as an art form does not exist in Asian drama. Okay, I'll show you two examples. What you see here is an excerpt taken from an entry in Princeton Encyclopedia of Poetry and Poetics, published in 1974. Now, in the entry, in this entry, the contributor defines tragedy as a form of drama that is different from plays of mere violence or disaster, and different from drama of sentiment, which is fine in itself. But later on, toward the end of the entry, he declares, okay, that tragedy is almost wholly a phenomenon of the Western world. Now, he does not offer any explanation for the absence of tragedy from Eastern cultures, and tries to get away by using this initial adverb, okay, strangely, for the last sentence, which is highlighted here again in red font. This is one example, okay? And here is another example, okay? And this slide is part of an entry from the online encyclopedia of Britannica. In this excerpt, unlike in the last one, the writer does offer reasons for the absence of tragedy in ancient drama. And he seems to hold Buddhism as a culprit for quieting passions instead of celebrating life, which he thinks is essential to tragedy. The second writer also thinks, okay, look at the lines here highlighted in blue color. The second writer also thinks that a true tragic hero should never find it sweet to die for his country. Okay? Now, it must be said that rather than giving satisfactory answers, these explanations offered by this contributor only lead to more questions and rebuttals. Why is suppression, for example, why is suppression of passion necessarily antithetical to tragedy? We have to ask this question. Or why is it not tragic to die for, that you have to die for your country? Okay? The inadequacy of these encyclopedic entries is made even more obvious by the following list of what many scholars call 10 masterpieces of Chinese tragedy. Here is a list of tragedies, masterpieces of Chinese tragedy, taken from a book edited by Professor Wang of St. Yat-sen University many years ago. And you have, 10 great tragedies written in Chinese. Now, interestingly, item numbered 2 and 5 highlighted here. Okay? they contain a tragic protagonist who sacrifices his or her life for the good of the country. And they are considered to be, by many Chinese scholars, to be very tragic. Okay, so this is one example. And also worthy of notice is the fact that most of the plays in this list have what is called a happy finale or happy ending. Now, for George Steiner, tragedy is dead. When villains, this is his own word, when villains reform and lovers and heroes walk hand in hand at the close of the story. Okay, this is a quote from his book. Okay, happy ending and the death of the tragedy. Raymond Williams, however, Raymond Williams, however, suffering and death are not merely personal matters. They elicit various responses from the rest of the society, including the latter's, meaning the audience's inclination to transcend human misery of all kinds. Such inclination is often aesthetically realized as the writer's confirmation of positive human values at the end of tragic works. In other words, Raymond Williams thinks that happy ending does not affect the fact it's a piece of tragedy. Now, and this is here are Raymond Williams' own words about this situation. And I quote, "We think," this is from Raymond Williams' Modern Tragedy, "we think of tragedy as what happens to the hero, but the ordinary tragic action is what happens through the hero. When we confine our attention to the hero, we are unconsciously confining ourselves to one kind of experience, which in our own culture, in Western culture, we tend to take as a whole. Yet over a wide range, we see this transcended in tragedy, including in Chinese tragedy. Okay, the death is transcended. Okay? Life does come back. Life ends the play again and again. Now, the fact that life does come back, that its meanings are reconfirmed and restored after so much suffering and after so important death, has been quite commonly the tragic action. This is Raymond Williams's view on tragedy. And this great insight, I want to point out, is particularly relevant to Chinese drama of Wu, where positive values are more often than not reconfirmed. So here is Raymond Williams's relevance to the study of Chinese drama of Wu. There are, of course, many other insights in Raymond Williams's Modern Tragedy that are equally enlightening. And for that reason, I recently wrote an article on Raymond Williams's tragic theory as a whole. And the article is scheduled to come out in Research on Marxist Aesthetics, edited by Professor Wang, later this year. The book is scheduled to come out later this year. And in this slide, okay, what you see is an abstract in English. Okay, let me just read it out and explain and highlight a few points here and there, so that you have an idea what I write in that particular article. Now, what I say in the abstract is this: after the publication of Nietzsche's The Birth of Tragedy, various schools of tragic thoughts have appeared in the West, but most of them seem to be mere modern versions of classic theories, modern versions of Nietzsche, modern versions of Schopenhauer, and etc. But one conspicuous exception to this is the cultural materialist theory of tragedy put forward by Raymond Williams in the middle of the 20th century. I think Williams' theory stands out among all kinds of tragic theories. And his theories are characterized by the following two important points. Number one, Williams advocates a historical approach that examines the various forms of tragedy in relation to the different structures of feeling that made them possible. Okay. Number two, okay, artists, okay, actively engage in social reform and social change. So he points out that art, including literary tragedy, is not a passive record of social life. It is a product of the artist's active participation in social life. And for this reason, tragic drama expresses artists' different responses to human suffering, hence its great social importance. And that's why he wrote the book. As Williams himself puts it, tragedy attracts fundamental beliefs and tensions of a period. And that's why it's important. It's a cultural site where we debate what is tragic, what should be avoided, and what should be eliminated. Anyway, this is just an abstract of my upcoming article. If you're interested in reading the whole thing, then you may subscribe to this research on Marxist aesthetics edited by Professor Wang. And this is all I have to tell you on my research and on Raymond Williams's theory of tragedy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ning Ersu. Yeah, fascinating engagement with the question of tragedy in Williams, and using Williams to deconstruct certain, well, Orientalist tropes. The idea that there's no tragedy in the East,
Asian
so to
drama,
speak.
yes.
Very. I think well, just that use of Williams is interesting. Absolutely. Okay, how are we doing? We're on time, and we have about 20 minutes for discussion. I'm just noticing there's quite an interesting discussion in the chat regarding the translation of the novels, with Shintaro Kono describing the situation in Japan, which where we were last Friday. And then in the Q&A, there was a question for Delin regarding how do we make Williams' research more comprehensive. The first step is to translate his novels, was Delin's suggestion there. Carla Boucher from Brazil writes in, you talked about the different time zones. I've noticed that we've had a couple of our colleagues from Brazil with us this morning, and it's even earlier there, or certainly was at the beginning. So this is Carla asking Professor Delin, thank you for your presentation. I'm very interested in your work, since I'm also studying Williams's reception and translation, but in Latin America. My questions are, number one, if you noticed an increase in the number of citations of Williams's works after the translations of the books in mainland China or Taiwan, or do the graduate students tend to reference the original titles in the original languages, presumably? And do you notice any particularities within each area in their use of Williams? For example, do sociology scholars tend to reference specific works more than, say, literary or historical scholars? Any responses to that?
Okay, can you hear me then?
Yep.
Yeah, I think since the 1980s on, Raymond Williams has been read and researched by the Chinese scholars. And in my understanding, yes, Raymond Williams is on the one hand read and researched by scholars in quite a few disciplines such as literature, sociology, history, etc. But mainly by the literary scholars, especially especially by those devoted to the study of literary theories, because in the end, Raymond Williams is mainly accepted as a literary theorist. In my understanding, yeah, I said, yeah, I hope in the future we could have a more comprehensive understanding of Raymond Williams, because in my understanding, Raymond Williams is the first literary critic. So he is not the first of all literary theorist, but a literary critic. So yes, on the one hand, many Chinese scholars have been appropriating Raymond Williams' ideas, especially his, for example, his structural feeling, and or his cultural materialism, etc. However, the Chinese scholars are just are doing their research on the theoretical level, on the level of theory. They still articulate the theory and the criticism, the practice criticism. So okay. Since the Chinese symposium, we quite a few young scholars have got me informed that they are interested in translating Raymond Williams' novels, and I am now getting into contact with two of the publishing houses, and one publishing house is quite interested in that. Maybe we I'll meet their their chief editor next week. Yeah. Okay.
That sounds very promising. That's good to hear.
Yeah.
I'm seeing a question here to me from Xiaohong Jiao regarding Raymond Williams's relation to Gramsci. Maybe I can answer that by asking a question of you, our participants. In that, Professor Delin, you mentioned the emergent, the dominant, and the residual. One of the similarities between Williams and Gramsci is in the role of culture in creating a sense of consent within society. That is, that power isn't only exerted militarily or by force, but can be generated or sustained through cultural practices. And this, and perhaps I'm generalizing, and you can correct me here, but in some ways, this is the particularity of Raymond Williams's work in the context where socialism, if you like, is democratic. You know, socialism has to face defeat. And in the 20th century in Britain, it mainly has been in defeat. You know, Raymond Williams is mainly writing in the context of right-wing and later neoliberal governments. You mentioned both Thatcher and Brexit in your paper, Delin, and you know, that's the context we're working in now. In China, it's different, right? We're not dealing with liberal democracy. There's a different direction. So one wonders then, to what extent do those kind of theories about cultural consent function within a Chinese context? Is it, for instance, significant that it's the later, more scientific, if you like, or Marxist Williams that seems to have been received first, and that the long revolution and culture and society came later. Listening to you, it struck me in some ways that the reception of Williams in China has been backwards, in the sense, not that backwards as in derogatorily backwards, but working backwards chronologically, in that Eagleton comes first maybe, and then the discovery of the latter Williams, and then the earlier Williams comes afterwards. I wonder if you have some thoughts about that. Maybe Professor Wang Ning first on that, as someone who actually was active in opening Raymond Williams to a Chinese audience.
Well, that's true. Williams, since Williams did not get the direct contact with Chinese scholarship, so that's why Williams came later than Terry Eagleton. Terry Eagleton, came to China as early as the 1980s. The first 4 years, he was invited by Wang Fengzhen to visit China, and then after his first visit to China, many of Terry Eagleton's works have been translated into Chinese. And then in the 1990s, yes, I co-organized the International Conference on Cultural Studies, China and the West, with the University of Virginia and New Literary History, Boundary 2. I did invite at the advice of my old friend Ralph Cohn, who used to be editor of the New Literary History. I think Ding also attended that conference. That conference turned out a tremendous success. And then we put up a special issue in New Literary History, Culture Studies, China and the West. I think that is the first, English publishing on cultural studies from Chinese perspective. And Terry Eagleton gave a keynote speech. That is on the contradiction of postmodernism, in which he also quoted and mentioned Raymond Williams. So in the 1990s, Williams, with some of his major works translated into Chinese, had already been, attached importance to as one of the leading figures of Marxist literary theory. So Williams is chiefly studied by China's literary scholars in the literary field. And then after that, there was a silent period. That means we seem to focus on the more heatedly discussed topic on postmodernism and post-colonialism. And then after the new century, Williams came to China again with his important place in culture studies. So we found that he is also a leading figure of culture studies, and he could do at the same time all the three fields: literary creation, literary theory and criticism, and culture studies. So a lot of literary scholars who are interested also in culture studies try to follow the example of Raymond Williams, including myself. So yes, we had two, figures of Raymond Williams in China.
And when you describe Marxism and literature as a monumental text, I mean, is its significance in some ways precisely the challenge to a sort of economistic model of base and superstructure that is still largely embraced in other fields? What makes it monumental in a sense for you?
That is his particular attention to the culture and the language aspects, which are overlooked by Marx and Engels. So that's why Raymond Williams put forward, the concept of culture materialism. Overlooked
by Marx and Engels, but also then by
because
Chinese interpreters of them.
When we talk about Marxist critical principle, we always talk about the social historical plus a little bit aesthetic, aspect as the critical principle and the model. But Raymond Williams has opened up a new aspect, that is culture and language. you know, and even his concept of culture is divided into three parts: and residual, dominant, and also emergent. So all these three, you know, forms of culture could coexist, according to Raymond Williams. You know, he could handle in a juxtaposed way, yes, all these three culture forms. Yeah.
I can't see any more questions in the chat. Yes, Maria.
One is to Professor Wang. Perry Anderson didn't list Raymond Williams as one of the Western Marxists, as Williams, you know, stresses more on the concrete lived experience rather than the whole. So how do you think about this? Do you still think Williams as one of Western Marxists, typical Western Marxists?
I think, you know, of course, since Williams was born, yes, in Great Britain, into a working class family, you know, he even joined Marxist movement in his young age. Later on, he spent much time dealing with Marxist literary critical principle based on the superstructure, and he found a kind of cultural materialism. So in this way, some people think that he is not as, you know, going far away as those typical Western Marxists, you know. But on the other hand, yes, from our Chinese perspective, yes, we do think Raymond Williams as a Western Marxist who is more involved in orthodox Marxist movement because of his family background and his political practice engaged in, you know, Marxist movement. You know, many other, you know, Western Marxist theories do think Marxism as a kind of branch of philosophy rather than, you know, I should say, a revolutionary principle, you know, a socialist, you know, theory so much and so forth. So that's why, you know, we disagree with Perry Anderson.
Thank you. And I have one more question for Professor Ding. Raymond Williams actually mentions a lot about tragedy, revolution, and alienation in his modern tragedy. Could you please elaborate a little bit on their relationship? The relationship between tragedy, revolution, and alienation.
Two things. Number one, Raymond Williams has a very unique understanding of revolution. He wrote a book entitled Long Revolution. It's a long and gradual process of social change. It's different from the kind of violence that often occur, you know, before the change of power. For Raymond Williams, this is the one particular point in the whole process. Even after the change of power, change of government, revolution continues, and so so it's not just, you know, the killing, the bloodshed that is involved in the revolution, the moment of overthrowing a particular government. It's also about the oppression of a particular government of its people. So this is one particular view about the relationship in tragedy and revolution that is held by Raymond Williams. And also Raymond Williams, you know, he inherited the Marxist tradition, and part of which is Hegelian. Then there are important historical moments, okay? And those important moments, and Professor Wang has been talking about the residual, the dominant, and the emergent. But then the confrontation, okay, you know, when a big social change is about to happen, and then, you know, and there tend to be, you know, very intense and fierce social conflicts, and that's where tragedy turned to occur. In other words, for Raymond Williams, tragedy tend to concentrate in the historical areas where there are huge and important and societal changes. So that's his understanding of the relationship between tragedy and revolution. One more thing, I cannot emphasize enough. Revolution for Raymond Williams is a gradual and long process, which is why he has that book, The Long Revolution. It's not the eruption of power and social violence. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. Thank you, Prof.
Any other questions from panelists on the screen?
Okay, Professor Daniel Williams, I would like to see, could I say a few words?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Okay. Just because just now question is how to make achieve a better understanding a comprehensive understanding of Raymond Williams. I think okay. In terms of intertextuality, on the one hand, we should yes read and study Raymond Williams' writings, his books. But on the other hand, I think we should read what the people studies of Raymond Williams. For example, what Todd Pinkney's Raymond Williams or Di Smith. Raymond Williams or Warrior's Tale, etc. I think the research result is essential for a comprehensive understanding of Raymond Williams. And here I'd like to recommend a very important book to me, that is Hayward Dix After Raymond Williams. This is a I think, in my understanding, this is a very good book. For example, yeah, in some as quite a few just mentioned, yes, Raymond Williams is what many use helpful, is especially helpful in literary studies. But in fact, he could be very useful in his historical studies. Yeah, because yeah, what he is doing is always articulate the literary expressions and the history, especially the history of modernization. Okay, that's all I want to say. Back to you, Daniel.
Yeah, thank you. People might not be familiar with Howell Dix's book, After Raymond Williams. Yes, it's actually part of a series that I co-edit with my colleague Kirsty Bahata from Swansea. There have been some other publications that I should mention, perhaps. Stephen Woodhams has edited a book called Raymond Williams and the World this year, and includes some material in relation to China in that. And then, well, I've mentioned Who Speaks for Wales already, my edition of Williams's writings, contextualizing him. I have one further question I'd like to ask you before we close, because you've all discussed translation in different ways, and some of you have translated Williams. Sometimes in the meeting of thinkers and cultures, Edward Said describes the process of traveling theory.
Yeah.
What is untranslatable is interesting. You know, what are the words or concepts that pose a particular challenge to the translator? I wonder whether you have any comments on that. You know, in the process of engaging with Williams and translating him for a Chinese audience and into Chinese, are there ideas that actually don't translate very well, and does that tell us something about the different cultural contexts? Maybe Professor, well, anyone who'd like to respond to that?
I think in translating his novels, one of the challenges might be the Welsh. There are many Welsh words, so it could pose quite a big challenge. with translating his trilogy, especially People of the Black Mountains, actually.
Yes, that's true. Takashi Onuki from Japan actually gave a conference paper on that, just because looking particularly at the ways in which Welsh names had become anglicized in the border country of Raymond Williams's upbringing. So what does the translator do? Does he or she go back to the original Welsh to translate the meaning of the place? Because that's lost in the anglicization of it. The anglicization tends to be sort of a phonetic attempt to capture the Welsh and actually has no semantic meaning, if you follow me.
Yeah.
So yeah, you know, so the challenges of those kind of levels. I suppose I was thinking, Ning Ersu was talking about revolution. You know, does revolution in Raymond Williams's work translate into revolution as it might be understood in China? I think the notion of tragedy, you were already indicating that Raymond Williams is opening up of the definition from Steiner. There's something actually that reminds me of Brecht versus Lukács in that, you know, that Lukács wants to defend realism and the Balzac type of 19th century realism, whereas Brecht wants to emphasize that realism is an aim that has to change, that calls for different formal contexts as reality changes, the nature of oppression changes. So you need different formal strategies to expose it. And Raymond Williams does something similar with tragedy, it strikes me. You know, it can't be just one thing. The nature of tragedy, the nature of tragic experience changes. Changes chronologically, but presumably might change in different cultural contexts as well. And that surely poses a challenge for translation.
Well, can I respond?
Yeah, please. It was meant as a question.
It's not so much a challenge for the translator as for those who try to understand his works. When you do the translation, there are technical terms like revolution and tragedy. You just translate them. These are just technical terms, and then you just translate them as they are. But you have to explain, and that's what I have been doing. You have to explain to your reader what he meant by revolution, which is a long process of social change, and what he means by tragedy. It's not just literary tragedy, but also what happens, the human suffering on a massive scale, like war, the poverty, and this is what he means by tragedy. But you know, when you translate those terms into Chinese, you can't do it all at once. But these terms are more or less the same. But his view on these concepts need to be explained, okay, in academic papers and articles and even books. That's how I feel. Yeah.
No, I hear you. But on the other hand, those technical terms, as Raymond Williams teaches us, have a history, right? You know, keywords is about the etymological implications and the way certain kinds of meanings get lost, but they're nevertheless residually there. So culture still has this notion of cultivation of the land, despite it now meaning something much more general. And
that's true.
You know, different languages have different resonances. Words have different histories, and that's often, well, it's kind of a challenge.
Raymond Williams himself said at one point that he wished that the word culture has never existed. Remember that comment he made? He wished that this particular word had never existed because the word culture itself is ambiguous, open to many different interpretations.
Yeah. Professor Wang, Ning, do you have any comments on that?
No, I haven't translated any works written by Raymond Williams. I just published some articles, dealing with his literary theory and his principle of the study of word literature so much and so forth. So that's why I don't want to say anything. So actually, when we translate Williams' terms into Chinese, we are actually do some theoretical interpretation. In this way, yes, I agree with Wolfgang Isa. Translation is more or less a kind of interpretation.
Yeah, and that's where the interest might lie at a sort of meta level. I could see a question appearing, but it seems to have disappeared.
There's one question by Shintaro.
Yes, I can see that. To a general question from Shintaro, we'll make this the last question of the session before we break then. How is Raymond Williams' idea of community received in China? It is a very difficult point in Japan, as we have no tradition of the working class community in the way that Raymond Williams speaks of it in Japan. Is this something that's untranslatable, as Daniel is saying? So Shintaro has translated some of Raymond Williams's work. So clearly this notion of community in relation to class community has been problematic for him. What about in a Chinese context? That's for anyone. I don't want to pick on anyone.
Professor Wang would answer this question about the translation of community.
Community, yeah, I think, of course, if we just write in English, it's okay. But if we just write in Chinese, we could translate community into different versions. In sociology, and we usually translate it into 社区, or in the study of globalization, we often translate it as 社群, and also into 群体. And now, if we deal with, building up a community of shared interest for future, that is the so-called 人类命共同体. So we have different versions, although in English is the only one. So I'm sure, yes, when we deal with this term, because I have never read any Chinese versions of Raymond Williams, so I have no comment on this. I always read Williams in the original, so that's why I cannot say anything about that.
Well, you did just say something very interesting about it. So, but yes, I can see that. Yeah, then reading in translation is a different issue. That's interesting. Okay, well, the question that appeared and disappeared, and I didn't see it, but it did seem to allude to a quotation from Mao in Marxism and Literature, and Raymond Williams' own references to China. In Country and the City, China, Vietnam are referred to as examples of, well, peasant revolt in a sense, that revolution of a Marxist kind took place in nations that weren't industrially advanced in the way that had been foreseen. And Raymond Williams, although he's from South Wales, which is associated very much with coal mining and class consciousness, was from the border area, which was a rural area. His experience is in a sense a peasant experience, and I think his affinity or interest in peasant revolt derived from that. Okay, let's take a break. Thank you all three for a terrific opening session. We return at 12:30 Wales time. What's that? 7:30 for most of you. I imagine there are several time zones across China, aren't there? But yeah, see you in 20 minutes, therefore. But let's close by just thanking our three speakers very, very warmly. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.